Late November, 1879, Stillwater Bend, Wyoming. The letter promised me one husband. Della gasped, her face turning ghost white as three towering men emerged from the snow-covered pines. You're right, Nate said, his gray eyes filled with quiet regret as he held out a stagecoach ticket. You can leave. Before the men hunting, you find this place. Why would a desperate runaway bride choose to stay with three strangers instead of taking her only chance to escape? Stay with us until the end. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and share for more unforgettable Wild West stories. The stagecoach stopped at nothing. That was the honest truth of it. Just a crooked signpost, half buried in snow. Two words burned into the wood. Stillwater Bend. Below it, a dirt road that cut into a wall of dark pines and disappeared. No depot, no platform, not even a bench to sit on while a person reconsidered every choice they'd ever made. Della Marsh pressed her face to the frosted window. Her breath fogged the glass. She wiped it with her sleeve and looked again, as if the town might appear on a second try. It did not. End of the line. The driver called down from the box. He didn't sound sorry about it. She gathered her wool coat, her small leather bag, and the silver locket at her throat. Her fingers found it without thinking. They always did. She climbed down, and the wind hit her like a door swung open too fast. Wyoming in late November. Nobody had warned her about this. Nobody had warned her about a lot of things. The stagecoach rolled away before the dust even settled. 4 horses, 6 wheels, gone around the bend. She watched until the sound of it faded, and the only thing left was the whistle of wind cutting through the pines. She turned. 3 men stood at the tree line. They were enormous. All 3 of them, broad across the shoulders, tall enough that the pines behind them looked almost average-sized by comparison. They wore heavy canvas coats and wool hats dusted with snow, and they watched her with expressions she couldn't read from 50 yards out. She squared her shoulders anyway. She had signed the papers. She had made the agreement. 1 husband, the advertisement said. 1 man, a modest homestead. Honest work. She could manage that. She had managed worse than that. But as she walked toward them, she counted again. 1, 2, 3. 3 men. Her slowed on the packed snow. The tallest one pulled his hat off before she even reached him. He held it against his chest and stood there in the cold, with his head bare. The eldest, she guessed, from the way the other 2 framed him, like they'd done it their whole lives. His dark hair was wind-torn and his jaw rough with stubble, but his eyes were steady, gray as the winter sky above the ridge. Miss Marsh, his voice was low, unhurried, like a man who didn't feel the need to fill silence. I'm Nate Calder. These are my brothers. He nodded to his left. Jonah. The broader man there had warm brown eyes and offered a careful nod. He was reading her reaction and working hard not to crowd her with it. Then Nate gestured to his right. And Levi, the youngest, had his arms crossed and his jaw set, gaze pointed somewhere past her shoulder. He was making a deliberate effort to look anywhere but directly at her face. Della stopped a few feet away. The letter said 1 husband. Yes, ma'am. Nate didn't flinch. That was our mistake, and we should have been clearer. I apologize for it. She looked at all 3 of them. Jonah had his hands loose at his sides. Open like a man who wanted her to see, he wasn't holding anything. Levi was still studying the tree line. Nate just waited, hat pressed to his chest. All 3 of you, she said. It wasn't a question. She just needed to hear it. Said plainly. All 3 of us, he confirmed. Wind pushed through the gap in the trees, and she pulled her coat tighter. 3 men, 1 woman, a piece of paper that already had her signature on it, and the nearest town God only knew how many miles back down that road. She had left Baltimore with $42, 1 change of dress, and the clothes on her back. There was nothing behind her worth returning to. She'd made her peace with that somewhere around Ohio. Then Nate reached into his coat and pulled out a folded ticket. He extended it toward her. She looked at it without taking it. Stage runs east again Thursday, he said, 2 days from now, if you want to go back. This gets you as far as Cheyenne. We'll cover the rest of the fare. He paused. You don't owe us anything. Miss Marsh, you came out here on our word, and we gave you an incomplete one. That falls on us. She stared at the ticket in his outstretched hand. Nobody had ever handed her a way out before. People either trapped her or they left her. They took or they walked away. They did not stand in the blowing snow with their hat pressed to their heart and say, "You don't owe us anything." Jonah cleared his throat. "We've got a fire going back at the hollow. Hot coffee." A pause, no conditions attached. Levi finally looked at her, just for a second. His dark eyes moved across her face, and something shifted behind them before he turned away again. She breathed in a lungful of cold air and let it out slow. Then she reached out and took the ticket, folded it once, tucked it into her coat pocket without breaking eye contact with Nate. "I'll make my decision by Thursday," she said. Something moved in his expression then. Subtle. It wasn't relief exactly. It was closer to recognition, like he was seeing the shape of who she was and filing it away with care. "Fair enough," he said. He stepped back and gestured toward the trees. "After you, Miss Marsh." She walked ahead of them into the pines. The cold followed her in, but so did the smell of wood smoke, drifting down from somewhere higher up the ridge, and she kept walking toward it. One hand stayed on the locket. The other stayed on the ticket in her pocket. Both of them felt the same, for now, like something she wasn't ready to let go of yet. She made her decision before dawn. Della lay on the cornhusk mattress in the Calder's bunkhouse, staring at the ceiling in the dark, and she didn't agonize over it the way she'd expected to. She just lay there and listened to the wind and thought it through, the way she thought through most hard things, quietly, alone, without asking anyone's permission. Baltimore was behind her, truly behind her now, in a way it hadn't been during the long weeks of travel west. The ticket on the windowsill was just a piece of paper. It didn't reach back to anything worth reaching for. She got up, folded the ticket in half one more time, then in half again. She set it on the windowsill with care and left it there. She wasn't throwing it away. She wasn't burning it. She was a practical woman, and practical women kept their options. But she left it behind when she walked out the door. Jonah was already at the stove. He handed her a coffee cup before she'd said a word, without looking up from the oatmeal he was stirring, as if he'd simply set a place at the table for whoever showed up. She stood by the warmth of the stove and drank it. Nate came in from the barn a few minutes later, stomping snow off his boots, hanging his coat on the peg. He looked at her once, reading her face with those gray eyes, and she could see him deciding not to ask. "I'll stay," she said. He was quiet for a beat. "All right," he said. Then he poured himself coffee and sat down at the table. That was it. She'd half expected him to exhale with relief, or thank her, or say something about the trouble they'd gone to bringing her out here. He did none of those things. He just accepted what she'd said and moved on, as if her staying was no more dramatic than the weather. And she found she liked that about him. The ride to Stillwater Bend took 40 minutes by buckboard along a road that was more suggestion than road, winding through heavy pines with the mountains riding high and blue above the tree line. She sat up front with Nate, who drove without comment, and Jonah and Levi rode behind on horseback. The air smelled like pine sap and cold, and something faint underneath it, like iron or stone. She breathed it in until her lungs ached from the temperature. The town itself was 3 blocks of purpose-built buildings and not much else. A general store, a livery, a saloon, a feed depot, a church at the far end of the main road with a fresh whitewash coat and a bell tower that was maybe 8 feet tall. It was the most modest house of God she had ever seen, and she meant that without criticism. There was something about its scale that felt honest. The preacher had wire spectacles and the serious, economical manner of a man who dealt in matters of consequence and had stopped being surprised by the variety of those matters some time ago. His wife, a small woman with a firm handshake, served as witness. Earl the blacksmith, who happened to be there fixing a hinge on the church door, got pressed into service as the second witness. He looked at the 3-to-1 arrangement with raised eyebrows and said nothing, which Della decided showed excellent judgment. The vows were brief. The preacher read from Bible, spoke the words in a measured cadence that had done real service over many years. And they repeated them in turn. Nate's voice was low and certain. Jonah's was warm. Levi said his part in a quiet, deliberate way that made it feel more like a promise than a ceremony. When it came to Della's turn, she was surprised to find her hands were steady. She'd expected otherwise. Afterward, outside the church, Earl shook Nate's hand and said, "Well," which covered everything adequately. Jonah offered the preacher's wife a small wrapped package of smoked venison, which she accepted with genuine pleasure. And then they loaded back into the buckboard and rode north toward the hollow. Jonah talked on the way home. He pointed out every landmark like he was handing her pieces of the territory, one at a time: the frozen creek bed that ran under the snow, the gap between two ridge peaks that told you the wind direction, the old cottonwood that marked the boundary of Calderland. He said, "You ought to know the lay of all of this. A person who knows the land doesn't get lost in it, even in the dark." She asked questions, and he answered them without impatience, and by the time they turned up the long drive toward the hollow, she had the rough shape of the surrounding terrain fixed in her mind. She hadn't expected to be taught things. She'd expected to be managed. Calder Hollow came into view through the trees, a wide clearing ringed by pines, and at its center a low, long cabin built from dark timber with a fieldstone chimney up one side and a covered porch running the length of the south face. Behind the cabin stood a barn, a smokehouse, a small equipment shed, and a split-rail fence around a frozen paddock where two horses stood together in the cold. It wasn't what she'd imagined when she'd answered the advertisement in Baltimore, in the small office above the import company where she'd worked. She'd imagined something rougher, more temporary-looking. The Calder cabin looked like something built to last. The wood was stacked flush against the cabin wall. The fence rails were even. The porch roof was solid enough to hold snow without sagging. Someone had thought about this place over a long period of time and kept improving it. Inside, a long pine table, mismatched chairs, a rocking chair beside the hearth, iron hooks by the door. The hearth was wide and tall, deep enough to cook in. A candle burned in the center of the table, and she noticed that. She noticed it had been put there deliberately for today. Nate carried her bag from the buckboard and took it down the hall to a room at the far end. She followed. The room had a bed with a quilt on it, a washstand, a small braided rug, and a window facing west toward the mountains. Through the glass, the peaks were going orange in the afternoon light, and on the inside of the door was a deadbolt, brand new, the iron still bright, not yet aged to match the wood around it. "That's new," she said. "Put it in Tuesday," Nate said. He set her bag on the washstand and stepped back, giving the room more space. "Throws all the way from inside. Nobody gets through it once it's set." He looked at her steadily. "The three of us will sleep in the main room or the bunkhouse. You lock that door for as long as you need to. You don't owe any of us a reason for it. You don't owe us a timeline." She looked at him. He had his hat in his hands again. It was the only ceremony he seemed to know, and he reserved it for moments that required something more than words. "Why did you think to do this?" she asked. He considered the questions honestly. "Because you are a person," he said, "and a person gets to decide when they're ready for things, not somebody else on their behalf." He put his hat back on and walked down the hall. She stood alone in the room. The light through the window was going from orange to deep gold, and the mountains were doing something extraordinary. With the last of the afternoon, she looked at them for a while, and she reached out and slid the deadbolt home. The sound it made was heavy and certain, a real sound. She sat on the edge of the bed and pressed her palms against her knees. She waited for the old dread to come, the mapping of exits, the listening for footsteps, the reading of every sound in the walls as potential threat. She had been doing that for 3 years, with the same automatic precision she applied to breathing. It didn't come. What came instead was something she hadn't had in a very long time. It wasn't peace exactly. She didn't think she had access to peace yet. Not the uncomplicated kind, but it was rest. True rest. The possibility of it. Anyway, in a room that locked from the inside. She kept the deadbolt thrown for 6 nights straight. She came out for meals. She sat at the table in the evenings and listened to the brothers talk, Nate with his surveying reports, Jonah correcting his arithmetic, Levi carving something small from a block of pine, and the fire burned in the hearth, and the wind pushed at the walls, and the world outside was cold, and the room was warm. She went to bed when she was tired. She locked the bolt each time. Nobody knocked. Nobody tested it. Nobody mentioned it at all. On the seventh night, she came down the hall after the fire had burned low, and the main room was quiet. She went to bed, and her hand found the deadbolt, and she rested it there for a moment. She thought about the way Jonah had set out her coffee cup this morning without being asked, about the way Levi had looked up when she'd come around the corner of the barn this afternoon, briefly startled, and then gone back to his work without the careful, watchful stillness that men adopted when they thought a woman needed watching. She took her hand off the deadbolt, left it open. She didn't know if any of them noticed. In the morning, Jonah made extra coffee and set her cup on the table before she sat down. Levi looked up from his carving when she came into the main room and held her eyes for a full count of 3 before looking back at his work. Maybe they noticed. Maybe they said nothing, because there was nothing that needed saying. She was still deciding how she felt about people who understood that. Winter dropped hard off the Wind River Range sometime in the first week of December, and it did not arrive gently. Della woke one morning to a world that had changed overnight, 40 degrees colder than the night before. The window pane in her room was opaque with frost, and when she breathed, she could see it. The floor under her bare feet was like iron. She stood at the washstand, and the water in the pitcher had gone to slush at the edges. Baltimore winter was a different creature, cold and gray and miserable in its own way, but contained by brick and bodies and industry. Neighborhoods stacked tight against each other, so the shared warmth of 10,000 people added up to something. Out here, there were no neighborhoods. There was the cabin and the barn and the mountain, and nothing else for a long way in any direction. She dressed fast and went to the fire. Levi was already up, feeding the hearth. He didn't look at her when she came in, just reached back and handed her a folded blanket off the chair behind him. Without missing a beat, she wrapped it around her shoulders and stood close to the building fire, and didn't speak, and neither did he. And for a few minutes, the silence between them was almost comfortable. She started to understand, around that time, that silence was Levi's natural language. He wasn't cold. He wasn't dismissive. He simply didn't talk unless he had something to say. And he had enough respect for words that he didn't use them as filler. She'd been around men who talked constantly to cover their discomfort with her. Levi's quiet was different. His quiet assumed she was present and capable and didn't require entertaining. He had a forge in the barn, a proper one, with bellows and an anvil and iron stock stacked along one wall. He'd built it himself. Jonah had told her, poured the base, set the stone, sourced the equipment from a smith in Cheyenne over 2 summers. He was good at it. She could see that from the ironwork around the cabin, in the hinges and brackets and fire tools. All of them fitted precisely. Nothing decorative about them, but nothing careless either. She started coming to watch him work in the afternoons. She hadn't planned it. She'd wandered into the barn the first time because the cold outside was worse than usual, and the barn held heat from the animals. And Levi was there at the forge, and she stood at the back and watched. He didn't acknowledge her presence immediately. He just worked heating a length of iron in the coals, reading the color of it, pulling it out, and beginning to shape it on the anvil with a rhythm that was almost musical once you stopped tensing up at the sound. After a while, he said, without looking up, "Hand me the punch." She looked at the tools laid out on the bench beside her. She didn't know which one was the punch. She studied the shapes for a moment and picked the one with the tapered end, the one she'd watched him use to make holes in flat stock earlier in the week. She handed it to him. He looked at it, then at her, said nothing, went back to work. She had guessed right. She filed that away. She came back the next day, and the one after that. Slowly, he started talking while he worked, not in long explanations, but in observations. Iron hardens when it cools fast. Water, not air. Quench it slow, and it stays workable. And watch the color. Gray means dead. Orange means working. White means you've got maybe 3 seconds before you've ruined it. And once, very quietly, while he was straightening a warped bracket. You can fix most things if you catch them early enough. Leave them too long, and you're just fighting what they've already become. She wrote that one down in her mind and kept it. Jonah was a different teacher. Jonah talked the way rivers run, steadily and in one direction. And listening to him felt natural and easy. He taught her to fish through ice, standing at a hole cut in the frozen creek on 2 cold mornings in the first week of December. He handed her a rod and stood beside her in rubber boots and talked her through every step with the patient focus of a man who genuinely enjoyed explaining things. Angle the knife, he said, when she was cleaning the first catch. He demonstrated on his own fish, showing her the angle of the blade against the spine, the way the flesh came away clean when you did it right. Straight down, you lose half the meat. Angle in, then pull along the bone. She tried it. Ruined the first fish. He said try again without any weight to it. No implication of failure in his voice. And she did try again, and did better. How do you know all of this? She asked him, once, wrapping the cleaned fish in cloth while snow fell soft around them. He considered it. Grew up doing it, he said. But here's the thing about that. When you grow up doing something, you stop thinking of it as knowledge. It just feels like habit. It's worth remembering that it isn't. He looked out at the frozen creek. Everything you know how to do, even the things that feel automatic. Somebody taught you or you taught yourself. That's actual knowledge you earned. It doesn't stop being valuable just because it stopped feeling hard. She was quiet for a moment. I know how to keep accounts, she said. I worked in an import office in Baltimore for 3 years. I can reconcile a ledger faster than most men twice my age. Good, Jonah said. We've got a ledger at the cabin that hasn't been touched in 2 winters. It's a disaster. She laughed. It surprised her, the sound of it. He smiled at his fish. Nate was the quietest teacher of the 3 and the hardest to account for because he didn't seem to be teaching her anything at all. He just did his work, the way he always did. And she noticed over several weeks that his work had a way of being adjacent to hers. She would be bringing water from the well, and he'd be checking the fence line nearby. She'd be hanging laundry on the covered porch, and he'd be splitting wood at the block 20 feet away. She'd be trying to figure out the firebox on the cook stove, which had a temperamental draft, and behaved badly in wind, and he'd come in from outside, read the situation, and reach past her to adjust a single vent she hadn't noticed without making anything of it. Just fixed it and went back out. Once she came around the corner of the barn with a bucket that was too full and too heavy. She'd been stubborn about it, had filled it past the sensible line, and her arms were aching. Nate materialized from somewhere, picked up the other end of the carrying yoke she hadn't thought to use, and they walked the rest of the way together without a word. He set his end down when they reached the door, nodded once, and went back to wherever he'd been going. She started looking for him at the edges of things. The locket trouble started in the 5th week of winter, though it had probably been building longer than that. She'd worn it every day for 3 years. Real silver on a thin chain, heavier than it looked, against bare skin, day and night, through heat and cold, and work and sleep. She hadn't taken it off once in all that time, and it had never bothered her before. But the dry Wyoming air, and the cold, and the physical labor of ranch life had done something to the skin at her throat. It had gone raw first, then rawer. She'd ignored it, cleaned it in the mornings, and pressed a cloth to it, and said nothing to anyone, because the locket was not a thing she was willing to discuss. Not yet, and discussing the skin under it would lead to the same place eventually. Then, one morning, she touched the locket out of habit, and her fingers came back red. She cleaned it, covered it, went on with the day. But Jonah saw. He saw everything with those warm eyes of his, filing it away with the same quiet thoroughness he brought to weather and wood grain, and the color of the sky before snow. He said nothing for several hours. That evening, after supper, He appeared at her door with a small round tin in his hand. She recognized the smell before it was opened: calendula and beeswax, the same salve he used on Levi's hands after a long day at the forge. "For the skin at your throat," he said, extending the tin. She took it. He stood in the doorway, and he looked at her carefully, honestly, and said, "I'm not going to ask about the locket. I won't touch it. I won't look at it any closer than I already have. And I will never ask you what's inside it. That is entirely yours. It stays that way." He paused. "I just can't watch you bleed and say nothing." Her throat ached. She pressed her lips together. "Thank you," she managed. He nodded, turned to go. At the last moment, he stopped. He turned back partway, not looking directly at her, but not looking away either. "For what it's worth," he said. "A person doesn't carry something that heavy unless it's worth everything to her. And a thing worth everything deserves to be carried." He was quiet for a breath, even when it cuts. Then he left. She stood there alone with the tin of salve and her brother's memory and the weight of 3 years pressing against her ribs. And she stayed very still until she was sure she had hold of herself again. She applied the salve by firelight, sitting on the edge of her bed. It stung and then it eased. She kept the locket on. She would always keep it on. But she let herself accept the care for what it was. A man who'd seen her hurting and offered remedy without demanding explanation, without using her pain as a door to push through. She had told herself, when she'd folded that ticket and set it on the windowsill, that she was making a practical decision. Shelter, work, safety in numbers in a hard country, a fair trade among strangers. The Calder brothers were making that story harder to maintain, and she was beginning to suspect that was not an accident. The man rode into Stillwater Bend on a gray horse, and he matched the horse in almost every particular. Gray coat, gray eyes, gray patience. He tied up outside the saloon, ordered a whiskey he left untouched on the bar, and spread a folded paper on the wood in front of the barkeep. His name was Marcus Ridge. He'd come out of Denver 3 weeks before on a trail that was thinner than he'd let on to the people who'd hired him. But Marcus Ridge had built his reputation on two things: persistence and discretion. And there was enough money in this job to sustain both for a considerable time. "I'm looking for a woman," he said. He smoothed the paper flat. It was a portrait, hand-drawn and detailed, done by someone with real skill and real access to the subject. Honey blonde hair, blue eyes set wide apart, a jaw that was pretty and stubborn in equal measure. Traveling alone or under an assumed name. Medium height. There is a silver locket at her throat. Round face. Old design. She doesn't remove it. The barkeep studied the paper without touching it. Reward, $200. Ridge turned his untouched glass on the bar. Slow and deliberate. Like he did everything. Cash in Cheyenne. No conditions attached to the condition she arrives in. The barkeep said he hadn't seen anyone like that come through. Ridge believed approximately half of that and left the paper on the bar. He visited 3 more establishments in Stillwater Bend before sundown and asked the same question in each. He didn't know that a cousin of Earl, the blacksmith, was nursing a beer in the saloon's corner when he walked in, or that this man had passed Calder Hollow twice in the last month, delivering lumber up the North Road. He didn't know that the combination of honey blonde hair and a silver locket had lodged itself in that cousin's memory without his knowing it, waiting for something to connect to. By Thursday morning, Nate Calder knew about Marcus Ridge. Earl came up the road himself, early before full light, which told Nate something about how serious Earl considered the news. He stood on the porch and delivered it plain. A man had come into town 2 nights ago, asking questions. Gray horse, gray coat, carrying a paper with a drawing on it. The drawing matched Nate's wife. Nate listened without interrupting. He thanked Earl, sent him home with salt pork, and went inside. Jonah was at the table. Levi was near the door, arms loose at his sides. He'd been listening through the wall. Someone came into Stillwater Bend asking questions. Nate said, "The description they're circulating matches Della. There's a reward on her." Jonah set his cup down with deliberate care. Levi said nothing, but his jaw went tight and his eyes went somewhere cold. Della was standing in the hall doorway. She had come to start the morning fire and had stopped when she'd heard Earl's voice through the cabin walls. She stood with one hand on the doorframe, her face gone white and still, and the locket at her throat caught the low morning light. "Come sit down," Nate said. Even, quiet. "Nobody has come up this road yet," she said. "Yet," he agreed. He was not going to soften the truth for her. She came in and sat. The fire in the hearth was burning low and needed banking, but nobody moved to attend to it. Outside the window, the Wind River peaks sat under a clear winter sky, massive and indifferent and beautiful. Jonah and Levi moved at the same time. Jonah pulled his chair around to her side of the table. Levi came away from the door and stood behind her chair, not touching her, but close, the way a man stands when he has decided something, and the decision is in his posture. She felt them close around her like a wall being built, and this time she didn't bristle at it. "Do you know who sent him?" Jonah asked. He was looking at her steadily, the same way he looked at everything open, patient, unrushed. "I know the name Vandermeer," she said. Her voice was flat. "I don't know what story he's told, or what papers he's had drawn up. Men with his money can draw up any papers they want." She pressed her hands against the table. "He's had people looking for me before. I've stayed ahead of them. I didn't think," she stopped. "You didn't think you'd stopped long enough for them to find you," Nate said. "Yes," he nodded slowly. He pulled his own chair around so he was facing her directly, and he leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and looked at her with those steady gray eyes. "There are laws in this territory that can be purchased," he said. "We know that. Men with money can buy paperwork that says whatever they need it to say, and that paperwork can look very official and very binding." He paused. "I don't care whose name is on what piece of paper. I don't care what story Marcus Ridge is carrying in his coat. We are your husbands. This is your home and your land and your right. We will put our bodies between you and any man who comes up that road." The room was very quiet. She looked at Nate, then at Jonah, who held her gaze and gave one slow nod. The nod that meant he'd weighed the thing fully and was certain of it. Then she turned and looked up at Levi behind her chair. His eyes were burning. He was looking at the door, his jaw set, and his hands at his sides were utterly still. He said, without looking at her, "Nobody takes you off this mountain, not while I'm alive to stop it." She turned back to the table. She pressed her lips together and breathed through her nose and waited until she was sure her voice would hold, because she was not a woman who cried easily, and she did not intend to start now. Not here. Not in front of 3 people who had just told her they were willing to bleed for her. "What do we do?" she said. Nate stood up. He crossed to the shelf beside the hearth and lifted down a rolled map. He spread it on the table, smoothing the worn folds flat, and weighted the corners with a tin cup and Jonah's Bible and a split of firewood. It was hand-drawn and annotated in pencil in cramped, precise handwriting, Nate's handwriting. She'd learned to recognize it. He traced a road south from Stillwater Bend with one finger. "Ridge's fastest route to this hollow is here. The terrain doesn't offer another way. It's bluffs on the east, Rough Canyon on the west, and the road threads the only passable ground between them." He tapped the map. "He doesn't know this land. We do. That isn't a small advantage." Jonah was already leaning over the map. "There's the creek crossing here," he pointed. "Anyone coming up from Stillwater Bend has to cross it. The bank on the north side gives good sight lines south. We can post a watch. 2-hour rotations," Levy said, from behind her. "And we set up a signal system. Gunshot heard from the crossing means time to move." "Move where?" Della asked. "Farther up the ridge if it comes to that," Nate said. "We know those trails and he doesn't. We can stay ahead of any man who doesn't know the land." He rolled the map halfway and looked at her. "But I don't want it to come to that. I want to handle this properly, when the time is right. And in the meantime," he looked at her evenly. "In the meantime," he said, "you learn to shoot." She looked at him for a moment. She'd grown up in a house where women were kept away from dangerous things on the theory that ignorance was a form of protection. Her father had believed that. Vandermeer had believed it even more fervently, and he'd weaponized it. The men who had claimed to keep her safe had always done it by narrowing the world around her, cutting off knowledge and access and capability until the space she was allowed to occupy was small enough to control completely. Nate Calder was looking her in the eye and saying the opposite. He was saying that her safety was something she should be part of, that ignorance was a liability, not a shelter, that the tools for surviving in a hard world were hers to have, not his to hold on her behalf. "All right," she said. "When do we start?" "After breakfast," he said. Jonah stood up and went straight to the stove, pulling out the skillet and beginning to work like the matter was entirely resolved, because it was. Levi moved away from her chair and went to the window, looking out at the road, calculating things in his head she could only partially guess at. Della looked back at the map. She had spent 3 years outrunning one man's wealth and cruelty, carrying her brother's memory around her neck and her grief folded up tight in her chest. She'd gotten skilled at running. She told herself it was what survival required. She was beginning to understand. It was only part of it. The other part was this: knowing the land, knowing the tools, knowing the people standing beside you, not hiding behind them, standing with them, shoulder to shoulder, with the same ground under your feet and the same clear sky overhead. The Calders had given her a room with a lock on the inside. They'd taught her to read weather off a ridge, and to clean fish, and to tell the color of iron by the heat in it. And now they were going to put a revolver in her hand and teach her to use it. Not because they had to, not because they'd given up on protecting her, but because they had decided she was entitled to protect herself. She folded her hands on the map. Outside, the mountains were brilliant white against the winter blue. Marcus Ridge was out there somewhere, patient and gray on his gray horse, following a trail that led here. He had money and paperwork, and the backing of a man who had already taken everything from her once. She had a copper and pine hollow in the Wyoming mountains, and 3 men who had promised her their bodies as a wall between her and the road. After breakfast, she was going to add a loaded revolver to that list. She thought that might change the mathematics of things considerably. The storm came without warning on a Tuesday night in the second week of December. By morning, the world outside the cabin windows had been replaced by a solid, moving wall of white. The wind didn't howl. That word was too small for it. It screamed. It hit the north wall of the cabin in continuous sustained waves that made the timbers groan in their joints, and the sound of it was constant and total, like being inside a drum that someone never stopped beating. Nate stood at the window for a long time after breakfast, reading the sky the way Della was learning to read it. Then he turned back to the room and said, "We're in for at least 3 days, maybe 5. He said it without drama, just information, delivered plainly, so they could all make use of it. Levi went to the barn. Twice he pushed out through the back door against the weight of the snow and came back in wearing a coat that had turned white, carrying extra wood, extra feed, extra lamp oil. He stacked everything with the care of a man storing ammunition for a siege, because that was essentially what it was. Jonah took inventory: pantry, smokehouse stores, the root cellar under the trap door in the kitchen floor. He sat at the table with a stub of pencil and wrote numbers in his careful script: days of flour, days of salt pork, days of cornmeal. He looked up at some point and found Della watching him and said, "We're fine, more than fine. This is just math." She came and sat beside him and helped him finish the figures. By noon, the barn was invisible from the window. The cabin was not a small space for one person, for 4 people who had no option but to remain inside it indefinitely. Together, it became something different, smaller in the ways that mattered. Every sound carried. Every movement across the room was visible. The table occupied the center of the main room, and there was no way to move from the kitchen to the hearth to the hall without passing within arm's reach of whoever was sitting at it. Della noticed this on the first afternoon. She had always lived in close quarters, Baltimore tenement rooms. Then the rooming house after her father died. Then the cramped space above the import office where she'd worked. She understood shared space. She knew how to make herself small and navigable within it. But those spaces had been populated by people she was trying to avoid. This was different. She was trying to navigate around three men she was beginning, against her own careful management of herself, to want to be near. That distinction made the small cabin considerably more complicated. On the first evening, she sat in the rocking chair beside the hearth with her mending, and Levy came and sat on the floor 3 feet away with his back against the stone and his boots off, and a length of leather harness he was rewrapping. The fire between them and his silence beside her, and the storm slamming the walls outside. She found herself watching his hands while she worked. His hands were scarred and large, and moved with certainty over everything they touched. She made herself look back at her own work before he could feel her looking. He felt it anyway, she knew, because his hands paused, just for a half-second, and then resumed, without him looking up. She kept her eyes on her stitching. The second morning, Jonah taught her to make sourdough by the firelight. The starter was 12 years old, he said. He'd brought it from Missouri when they'd come west, wrapped in cloth in his saddlebag. She worked the dough on the floured table while he talked her through the timing of it, and at some point, her hands were deep in the dough. And she asked a question, and he leaned in from behind her left shoulder to show her what the texture should feel like, and his large, warm hand covered hers in the dough. He felt the way she went still. He eased back immediately, stepped to the other side of the table, kept his voice even. "That give," he said, "when it pushes back like that, that's what you're looking for." "Like that?" she asked, pressing into the dough. "Exactly like that," he said. He was looking at the bread. She was looking at the place his hand had been on hers and waiting for the fear to arrive, the old automatic bracing against contact. And what came instead was something she didn't have a clean name for yet. She worked the dough and let it go. Nate spent the first 2 days writing in his survey notebooks and sharpening tools. He did not crowd her. He would not have crowded her in an empty field. And he didn't do it in a confined cabin either. His awareness of her was different from the others, less expressive, harder to read, but she felt it consistently, like a low-frequency sound just below the threshold of hearing. On the second night, she came into the main room at midnight. She couldn't sleep. The storm was too loud and her mind was too active, and the fire had burned low. She came to tend it. Nate was already there, sitting in the chair she'd been using during the days, and he looked up when she came in without surprise, which meant he'd heard her footsteps in the hall. "Can't sleep," he said. It wasn't a question. "The wind changes pitch every couple hours," he said. "Takes some getting used to." She knelt by the hearth and began to build the fire back up. She'd learned to do this properly in the first weeks. At the hollow start, with the smallest stuff. Feed it air before wood. Don't rush it. She worked the bellows in a steady rhythm, and the coals brightened. And in that rising light, she was aware of him watching her with those steady gray eyes. The room had contracted further, with just the two of them in it, after midnight, with the storm outside and the fire beginning to build. "Nate," she said. "Yeah." She didn't know what she'd meant to say. She had come in with something half-formed in her head, and now she couldn't find it. Maybe it was just his name. Maybe she had wanted to say it in the dark, and hear whether it would feel different than saying it in the daylight. It did feel different. He didn't fill the silence for her. He just waited. "I'm grateful," she said, "for this, all of it. I know I haven't said it plainly." "You don't have to say it," he said. "I know I don't have to," she said. "That's why I want to." The fire was going now. She stayed crouched in front of it a moment longer, watching the flames find their new shape. And then she stood and went back to bed and lay in the dark and listened to the storm and thought about the look on his face in the firelight. Not hunger exactly, though that was in it. Something broader and deeper than that, held in careful check by a man who kept his promises with the same precision he built everything else. She lay there for a long time. She had spent 3 years being afraid of men. What she'd understood men to want was possession. Her body, or her labor, or her silence, or some combination of all three. She'd organized herself around that understanding for so long that dismantling, it was proving to be the most disorienting thing that had happened to her, including the stagecoach ride across the entire country. These three men wanted her. That much was unmistakable now. She could feel it in the cabin like a fourth presence, banked and carefully controlled, filling the available space without breaking through any surface. They wanted her, and they were choosing, every single day, not to act on it. Not because they didn't care, but because they did. That was the thing she couldn't stop thinking about. On the third morning, the storm was at its worst. The cabin shook. The windows were buried, and the light came in blue and strange. Underwater light. The light of a world sealed off from itself. Jonah made coffee, and nobody talked much because the storm was doing all the talking. Levi sat across from her at breakfast. He'd been up since before dawn. She could see it in his face. His dark eyes were tired, and his jaw was rough, and he wrapped his hands around his coffee cup and looked at her over the rim of it. "You doing all right?" he said. Two syllables she hadn't expected from him. "Yes," she said. Then, because it was Levi, and Levi understood truth better than reassurance, better than I expected. He nodded once. "It gets loud," he said. "The storm. Some people can't take it." "I've had loud in my life," she said. He looked at her for a steady moment. "Yeah," he said. "I figured." He went back to his coffee. But she felt him carry that small exchange with him for the rest of the day. The way he positioned himself slightly closer to her when they were both working in the kitchen. The way he handed her things without being asked. She had learned, over these weeks, that Levi's version of care was physical and proximate. He couldn't do words the way Jonah did, or quiet watchfulness the way Nate did. He did presence, proximity. He showed up and stood near, and let his nearness say what his voice wouldn't carry. By afternoon of the third day, the space between the four of them had contracted to something she could almost feel against her skin. She stood at the kitchen counter, slicing cold venison for supper, and Jonah reached past her for the salt, and his arm grazed her shoulder, and she held her breath, and he held his too, for just a moment, before he stepped back with the salt and said something ordinary about the biscuits. Behind her, Levi's footsteps crossed the room and stopped close, and she felt the warmth of him before he picked up a water pitcher from the shelf to her right and poured for all 4 cups, and his knuckles grazed the edge of her sleeve. She put the knife down. She gripped the edge of the counter and breathed. Nate was watching from the doorway. He was always watching from the doorway. He caught her eye, and she saw in his face what she knew was on hers. This mounting thing between them, the acknowledgement of it, the constant choosing to wait. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up the knife and went back to the venison. That night, she lay in her room with the deadbolt off. It had been off for weeks now, and she looked at the dark ceiling and listened to the storm and let herself think the thoughts she'd been refusing to think for several days with significant effort. She wanted this. She wanted them, not from loneliness, not from gratitude, though both of those were in her. She wanted them the way she had never in her life allowed herself to want anything openly, fully, without already planning the retreat. She wanted Jonah's warmth and Levi's hands and Nate's steadiness, and the way the three of them together made a circle around her that was nothing like a cage. She wanted to be inside that circle and let it close around her and not be afraid. The fear was still there. She'd be lying to herself if she said otherwise. But it was smaller than it had been in 3 years. And for the first time, she could imagine standing in the same room with it and not having it own her. She closed her eyes. She thought about the copper tub that stood on the east side of the cabin, beside the hearth, and the steam that filled that corner of the room when it was full. She thought about the firelight. She thought about the three of them. She made a decision. She lay with it for a while, testing it for panic, checking herself the way Nate checked the weather calm and thorough, reading the actual signs rather than what she wished them to say. No panic came. She folded her hands on her chest and let the storm rage and breathed until she was steady. And she thought, tomorrow, or the night after, when the time is right, she would know when it was right. She was beginning to trust herself again on things like that. It was the strangest feeling. It felt almost like being whole. The storm peaked on the fourth day and broke on the fifth. It didn't clear all at once. Storms like that never did. It stepped down in stages, the wind dropping from a scream to a roar, to a deep, persistent moan. And then, sometime in the small hours of the fifth night, it went quiet enough that Della could hear the fire in the other room. She lay in bed and listened to that quiet, and felt the cabin settle around her, like a thing that had been holding its breath and finally let it go. In the morning, there was 4 feet of snow against the cabin door, and a sky the color of blue glass. The mountains were so bright and sharp in the new light. They looked like they'd been cut from tin. The brothers dug out the door. Then the barn. They worked through the morning, all 3 of them in the snow up to their waists in places, and she stood on the cleared porch with coffee and watched. When they came in at midday, she had venison stew on the fire and 4 bowls set out. Nobody said much over the meal. The relief of the storm being over was large and quiet, the kind of exhale that doesn't want commentary. After supper, Nate went to the barn for a final check. Jonah sat by the fire with his Bible, but she noticed he hadn't opened it. He was staring into the fire instead. Levi brought in more wood than they'd need for 3 nights running, stacking it with focused purpose that was probably about something other than wood. She went to her room. She stood in the center of it and looked at her reflection in the dark glass of the window. She'd been carrying Teddy's death for 3 years. She'd been carrying Vandermeer's violence for longer than that. She'd been carrying the belief, pressed into her bones by years of being managed and threatened and reduced, that her own body was a liability, something to protect, something to hide, something that would eventually be taken regardless of her objections. So it was better to become indifferent to it than to risk the grief of losing it. She looked at herself in the dark window. She took the sheer white nightgown down from the peg on the wall. She'd had it since Baltimore. Bought it for the marriage she'd been sold by the advertisement. Practical and clean, never worn. She changed into it slowly, with deliberate steadiness. And then she stood in front of the window a moment longer. Then she walked out of her room. The main room was lit by the fire alone. The lamp had burned low, and no one had refilled it. So the room moved in orange and shadow. The copper tub sat at the east end of the hearth, full and steaming. The brothers hauled and heated water every several days in winter, a practical matter of hygiene and warmth, and the surface of the water was still trembling slightly from the last bucket being poured in. All 3 of them were in it. The tub was large. She'd noticed that in her first weeks here, far larger than necessary for one person. Large enough to hold 3 men who had the shoulders that Calder men had. Nate sat at the far end, his head back against the rim, his eyes closed. Jonah sat across from him, forearms on his knees, water to his chest. Levi was to the side, hands flat on the copper rim, looking at the fire. The firelight moved over them. She stood in the hallway entrance. No one had heard her come in, or if they had, none of them moved. She stood there in the white nightgown with her feet bare on the cold board floor and the firelight touching the edge of her shoulder, the line of her jaw, the silver locket at her throat. Jonah saw her first. He went very still. Not a startled stillness, a deliberate one. He let his eyes find her face, and she watched him, read it the way he always did, thorough and honest. What he found there made him straighten slowly. Nate opened his eyes. Levi turned from the fire. None of them spoke. The fire cracked once, and the logs shifted and outside. Snow slid off the cabin roof with a soft sound. She crossed the room. Her feet were cold, and the floor was cold, and the air between her and the tub was full of steam and firelight. And she moved through it without stopping, because stopping had been the whole of her life for 3 years. And she was finished with it. She stopped at the edge of the tub. The water was dark and hot, and the steam rose off it in thin curls. She looked down at it. Then she looked up at them, at Nate's gray eyes, steady as they had always been, watching her with something so open and so contained. At once it almost hurt to look at directly. At Jonah, whose face had gone soft and careful, whose hands were already lifting slightly from the water, not toward her, but ready. At Levi, who had turned his whole body to face her now. his dark eyes burning. Her hands found the edge of the tub. She stepped in. The water was scalding, and her breath caught hard and her body adjusted, and the heat moved up through her feet and calves and thighs, and she stood there in the steam with the white nightgown going transparent at its hem. And all three of them absolutely motionless around her. Then Jonah moved. He moved slowly, with the care of a man, handling something he understood to be irreplaceable. His hands found her waist, through the thin wet fabric, and he drew her back until she was resting against his chest, his broad chest, the solid warmth of him pressing into her spine. He set his hands flat against her sides and didn't move them further. "Okay," he said. His voice was very low. "Yes," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she'd expected. Nate moved through the water toward her, slow and unhurried. He reached up and pushed the wet hair back from her face, tucking it behind her ear with 2 fingers, and then let his hand rest at the back of her neck with a warmth that moved down her spine. He was looking at her face. He did not look away. Levi reached from her right and tilted her chin up with the edge of his hand, his calloused, careful hand, and looked at her directly for the first time without looking elsewhere. His eyes were very dark and very certain, and she felt that certainty like heat from the forge, not threatening, but real, undeniable. She breathed. She had meant to keep breathing, but then Nate's hand at the back of her neck drifted forward, across her wet collarbone, and his fingers brushed the silver locket. She moved without thinking. Her hand came up and covered it both hands, pressing the locket against her chest, fingers laced over it. She bent forward slightly, and her breath went short and ragged, and all three of them went completely still around her, immediately and without question, the way they'd always gone, still when something mattered. "Della," Nate said, just her name. She was shaking. She could feel it in her own hands, in the rigid line of her spine, in the way her jaw had locked. 3 years of Teddy's hair and Vandermeer's button and the blood and the sound a boy makes when he falls. The silence, after all of it, was under her hands right now, slamming through her without mercy. Jonah's hands spread flat on her back, not rubbing, not patting, just there, constant. He pressed his warmth into her spine and held it, a fixed point she could orient herself against. Nate looked at her. He didn't say it's all right, because he was not a man who said things he couldn't promise. He didn't say let go. He said nothing about the locket itself, and he wouldn't, because he had made her a promise, and Nate Calder kept his. He waited. Then, slowly, patiently, with the same deliberate care he used for everything that required steadiness, he reached up and took her hands. He didn't rip them away. He didn't force them. He wrapped his large, warm hands around her, shaking ones, and held them for a moment, feeling the trembling in them, acknowledging it, letting her feel that he felt it, that he was not going to pretend it wasn't there. He looked at her eyes. She looked back at his. He said very quietly, "You don't have to put it down. You just have to let us be here with you while you hold it." Something broke open in her chest, slow and irresistible. He began gently to move her hands apart. She let him. She didn't stop shaking, but she let him. Her fingers uncurled from the locket, and he guided her hands to the rim of the tub on either side of her, giving them something solid to grip. And then Levi reached past her and pressed his open palm directly over the silver locket. His hand was massive, warm from the water. The heat of it covered the locket entirely and pressed it gently against her skin, and she felt the silver go from cold to warm under his palm, going from Teddy's cold grief to this, to the heat of a man who had spent the last 3 months standing between her and the road without ever being asked. She looked up at Levi. He was already looking at her. His eyes were still and dark and full of things she had no single word for. Recognition and sorrow and desire and a quiet ferocity that was directed not at her, but at everything that had ever made her shake like this. "Look at us," he said. His voice was rough and low, and she heard Nate and Jonah close around her, and all three of them were looking at her, their eyes locked on hers, their faces lit by fire. And Levi said it again, slow and absolute. "Look at us when we touch it." She looked at them. She looked at all three of them, and she gasped. not from fear. The fear was there. It would not vanish in a single moment. And she knew it, but it was small now and getting smaller, eclipsed by the heat of the water, and the weight of Levi's hand, and the steadiness in Nate's eyes, and the warmth of Jonah at her back. The locket against her chest was warm. Teddy was there, in it as he would always be in it. She would carry him until she died, but he was not a wound right now. He was a name and a face and a button and a lock of hair, and she was holding him in a room full of warmth. And there was room for both. There was room for all of it. That was the thing she had not been able to believe until this exact moment. The night stretched out around them, firelit and steam-filled. The wind outside gentle now where it had been murderous for 5 days. She let herself lean back against Jonah's chest. She let Nate's hands find her face. She let Levi's warmth hold the locket, and by extension, everything the locket held. She stayed in the water a long time. When it cooled, they brought her blankets from the cedar chest, and the fire burned low, and the storm was well and truly over. And the mountains outside were still and white and permanent, and she was not afraid. She had chosen this, every step of it, from the hallway to the edge of the tub, to the water itself, had been hers. Nobody had come for her. Nobody had taken anything. She had walked across that room on her own bare feet and stepped in of her own choosing. And that fact, that plain and simple fact, was the thing that unmade 3 years of being backed into corners. The body that had been a liability was hers again. She closed her eyes. Outside, the Wind River peaks stood in the dark, indifferent and enormous and permanent. She could feel them from here, through the cabin walls. She had learned to feel them that way. The way you feel large things that have been standing longer than anyone can remember. They would be there in the morning. They would be there long after. She slept without listening for anything. She woke with the firelight still going. The room was warm, and the light moved on the ceiling, the way it always did in the early hours. That slow orange drift she had learned to read almost as well as she read the sky. She lay still and oriented herself sound, light, temperature, safety, and then she felt the difference. Someone was awake in the chair by the hearth. She could hear the quiet creak of the rocking chair, the specific slow rhythm of it, and she knew without looking that it was Nate. He had a night-waking habit she'd noticed early on, in the deep hours, if something in him wouldn't quiet. He sat in that chair and let the fire work on him until it did. She lay and listened to the creak of the chair and the settling of the cabin, and the vastness of the post-storm silence outside, and let herself simply be here, in this, without analyzing it further. Eventually, she slept again. She woke the second time to daylight, real daylight, winter white and clear, pouring through the west window off the snow. She sat up slowly. She was alone. The fire had been built up recently. The logs were fresh and still crackling. Someone had done that without waking her. She sat on the edge of the bed. She expected to feel different than she did. She had spent most of her adult life braced for the morning, after feeling that came from being vulnerable. The regret and shame and defensive pulling back she associated with any moment of having opened herself. It had happened enough times, not in the ways Vandermeer had intended. She'd escaped him before it came to that, but in smaller ways, times she'd let herself hope, the times she'd trusted and been wrong. She sat and checked herself honestly. None of that was there. What she found instead was something she recognized from her early childhood, before everything had gone wrong. A feeling she associated with being 8 years old and waking up in the house she'd been born in with her mother still alive, and Teddy asleep in the next room, and the whole day not yet spoken for. An unrestricted feeling. Like the world had margin in it, she was allowed to move through. She got up and dressed. The main room was quiet when she came in. Jonah was at the table with the accounts now. She'd taken them over 3 weeks ago and reduced the chaos considerably, and he was reviewing her columns with the focused pleasure of a man who appreciated order and was grateful. He'd found it. He looked up when she came in, and his face did what it always did when he looked at her. That warm shift, that uncomplicated welcome. "Coffee," he said. It was already on the stove. He'd set her cup out. She poured it, and sat across from him. And he looked back at his work without making anything of her presence. And she appreciated that more than she could have said. Levi's in the barn, he offered, after a minute, and Nate, fence line, east side. He wanted to see what the storm did to it. She wrapped her hands around the cup. Outside the window, the snow was brilliant, and the sky was the deep blue of winter mornings when the cold is clean rather than punishing. She could see the corner of the paddock fence and the backs of the two horses standing side by side, the way they always stood, sharing warmth. "Jonah," she said. He looked up. She met his eyes directly. "Thank you. For last night. For all of it." He was quiet for a moment, in the way that meant he was giving the thing its full weight before responding. "Della," he said, "what happened last night was yours. We were there because you chose it. That choice was yours to make, and you made it, and we were honored by it." He paused. "Don't thank us for something that belonged to you." She thought about that for a while. It was a different frame than she'd been operating from. The idea that the choice being hers was the point, not the outcome, not the act, but the agency of it. She was the one who had walked out of that room and across the floor and stepped into the water. Nothing had been done to her. She had done it. She had been the one to move. "I've been managed for a long time," she said. "I'm relearning what mine means." "I know," he said, not with pity, but with the same clear-eyed honesty he brought to everything. "You're doing well at it." She laughed, quietly. "You don't have to say that. I'm not saying it for your benefit," he said. "I'm saying it because it's true, and true things are worth saying." She drank her coffee. She found Levi in the barn in the afternoon. He was at the forge, heating iron. She could tell from the glow before she was halfway through the barn door. That particular orange-white she'd learned to read. She stood back and watched. His back was to her. His shirt was unlaced at the collar and pushed up at the sleeves from the forge heat, and his shoulders moved with the same certainty she'd watched through weeks of afternoons. That knowledge of exactly what he was doing and why. He knew she was there. He had known the moment she'd stepped through the barn door. He let her be there for a while before he said anything. He worked the iron through one full pass on the anvil, checking its shape, returning it to the coals. Then, without turning, "You sleep all right?" "Yes," she said. He nodded, checked the iron. She came farther into the barn and leaned against the post of an empty stall, the way she'd learned to position herself when he was working close enough to watch, far enough to not interfere with the heat and the tools. The coals threw light on them both. "Levi," she said. "Yeah, what you said last night." She paused. "Look at us when we touch it." Another pause. "You knew what it would do." He was quiet for a moment. He pulled the iron from the coals and looked at its color, reading it, and set it back. "I knew you'd been looking away," he said. "From us, from yourself, from the locket." He kept his eyes on the coals. "You can't go forward looking sideways." She stayed with that. He was not a philosopher. He hadn't read widely or spoken in large rooms, but he had a directness that cut clean through everything decorative and arrived at the actual matter. And she had been learning from it in ways she hadn't anticipated. "You said something similar to me about the iron," she said, "a couple weeks ago, about not being able to fix what you won't look at." He glanced at her sideways, one brief, dark look, and returned to his work. "Same principle," he said. She stayed in the barn for another hour, watching him work. And by the end of it, she had learned to draw a length of iron to a taper. Not perfectly. She would need a week of practice before it looked like anything intentional. But she felt the shape of the skill under her hands, and she understood that skill was patient and repetitive and honest. And those were things she trusted. Learning a new skill is like that, she thought. You put your hands into it before you're ready. You make something rough and imprecise and keep going. The knowledge builds in the muscle, not just in the mind. The knowing and the doing have to find each other. She'd been relearning herself the same way for 2 months. Nate came back from the fence line at dusk. He came in cold, stomping snow, hanging his coat. She had supper ready. She'd made it herself, all of it. The first time she'd managed the whole meal without Jonah's guidance on the stove's temperament. And he looked at the table and then at her, and his gray eyes were warm. They ate, all four of them, with the fire going, and the cold outside, and the clean aftermath of the storm still in the air. Jonah talked about a problem with the accounts from the fall cattle sale that she'd identified and resolved, and he was telling it like a story, with the satisfaction of someone who appreciated a good solution. Levi ate steadily and watched her face when he thought she wasn't looking. Nate sat at the head of the table and said almost nothing, but his silence was full of something measured and contained, and she'd learned to read that too. After supper, when Jonah was washing up and Levi had gone out for a final check on the horses, Nate stayed at the table. She started to get up, and he said, "Quietly sit for a minute." She sat. He looked at her across the table, and he was doing what he always did, reading her, honestly, not managing what he found or softening it for either of them. "You should know," he said, "that nothing changes the terms we gave you. Everything we offered you when you stepped off that stagecoach still stands. The room, the bolt, the ticket." He paused. "If any of this ever stops being what you want, you say so. Plain." She looked at him. "And if it keeps being what I want," she said. He was quiet a moment, then a slow exhale, and something moved in his face. Not relief exactly, but the settling of a tension he'd been holding carefully for a long time. "Then we figure out the rest together," he said. She nodded. He nodded. That was its own kind of ceremony. She sat by the fire that evening and let herself feel what was actually in her. She didn't manage it down or negotiate it smaller, or preface it with all the appropriate caveats about why she shouldn't allow it. She let it be the size it was. She let the warmth be real. She let the trust be real. She let the grief be real, too, because it was still there. Teddy was still there. The locket was at her throat, as always, but she let the grief and the warmth occupy the same space, because she was learning. That was where they had to live. There was no clean separation between the two. She had wanted one for 3 years. She had tried to put the grief somewhere sealed, and the fear somewhere sealed, and find some remaining part of herself that was uncontaminated by either. And it had nearly emptied her. This was different. This was carrying all of it at once, with 3 people standing near enough to carry it alongside her, not taking it from her. She had no interest in having it taken, but present while she bore it, within reach when the weight went past what she could manage alone. A person who shared their burden chose who they shared it with. That choosing was power, not weakness. She understood that now in a way she hadn't before. Jonah came and sat in the other chair and picked up his Bible, and this time he actually opened it and read quietly to himself. Nate came in from checking the perimeter and pulled up a stool close to the hearth with his survey maps. Levi came back from the barn and settled on the floor the way he always did, back against the hearthstone, boots off, quiet. The fire burned. The mountains outside held snow and stood permanent in the dark. She was a woman who had walked across the country with $42 and a dead boy's locket and a ticket she'd left on a windowsill by choice. She had been kept small by design, untouched, unexperienced, reduced by years of management and fear, and the deliberate narrowing of her world to a space one man could control. But she had never been passive. She had survived 3 years of running on will and nerve, and the knowledge of what she was running from, what she was running toward. She understood now, had been here all along. She sat in the firelight and thought about Teddy. She thought, "I am not burned down. I am still here." She pressed her hand once to the locket at her throat, the gentle press of acknowledgement she had made 1,000 times. The same gesture that had once been desperate and clutching. The reflex of a woman holding herself together with both hands. Tonight it was different. Tonight it was the gesture of a woman who knew where she was standing, and she thought about what was ahead, the mountains she'd learned to read. The revolver Nate had put in her hand 4 weeks ago on a cold, clear morning and taught her to use, standing at the split rail fence, with the mountains at her back, until the recoil was familiar and her aim was true. The locket with its 2 small contents that she would carry to Cheyenne one day, onto a witness stand, and open in front of a court, with her head level and her voice steady. Vandermeer had tried to make her into someone without agency, without capability, without the right to say what had happened to her brother and what she intended to do about it. He had underestimated what 3 months in the mountains with 3 Calder men could do to a woman. Or rather, he had underestimated what 3 months of being truly seen and genuinely respected do to someone who had been denied both for most of her life. She was not the same person who had stepped off that stagecoach into the Wyoming wind. She was still Della Marsh. She still had her brother's hair at her throat. She still carried everything that had been done and everything that had been lost. She would carry those things to the end of her days, and she had stopped expecting otherwise. But now she also carried this, the sourdough starter, and the fish cleaning, and the iron taper, and the ledger columns, and the 4 cups of coffee set out every morning before she sat down. The deadbolt she had chosen not to throw, the revolver with its familiar weight in her palm, the 3 men asleep in the other room who had promised her their bodies as a wall between her and the road, and meant it in every particular. Vandermeer was going to learn all of that the hard way. She pressed her hand once more to the locket. Then she lowered it to her lap and sat in the firelight and breathed. And she was not afraid. The snow melted slowly through January. Not all at once, not dramatically, but in the way the mountains handled everything by degrees, over time, without ceremony. Each day gave back a little more of the ground. The creek unfroze at its center first, black water showing in a thin ribbon through white. The horses moved to the far paddock where the south-facing slope caught afternoon sun, and the footing was better. The pines dropped their loaded branches and stood lighter. Della noticed all of it. She had learned to read the land the way Jonah had taught her, as information, as useful knowledge, as something that told you where you were and what was coming. 3 months ago, she wouldn't have known the difference between a thaw and a break in the cold. Now she read it the way she used to read ledger columns, 1 line at a time, each entry meaning something. Marcus Ridge had not come up the road. Nate had word of him through Earl, who had a cousin in Stillwater Bend and a network of useful contacts spread across the bench towns along the South Range. A bartender here, a liveryman there. People who dealt in the quiet business of knowing what was happening and occasionally being compensated for sharing it. Ridge had spent 3 weeks in Stillwater Bend asking his careful questions, and then he had moved south, possibly toward Cheyenne, possibly regrouping. Nate relayed this at breakfast one morning without particular emotion. He said it plainly, because the truth was, the truth whether or not you decorated it. He's not done, Della said. No, Nate agreed. She already knew. She'd always known. A professional didn't stop when the trail went cold. He went back to the source, collected new instructions, possibly more money, and returned with a better plan. That was what had always happened. Every time she'd believed she was clear. Another man had come. Different name, different face, same errand. There's something you need to know, she said. She looked at her coffee cup for a moment. Then she looked the 3 of them around the table, Nate across from her, Jonah to her left. Levi at the end with his chair pushed back the way he always sat, giving himself room. She had been deciding when to say this for weeks. The weather had been settled in the copper tub on the night of the blizzard, in the moment when Levi's warm hand had covered the locket, and she had looked at all 3 of them and chosen, with her whole self, to stay. The when had required more time. Now was when. She reached up and unclasped the locket. It was the first time she had taken it off in 3 years. Her fingers knew the clasp without looking. She'd touched it 10,000 times, and never to open it, only to confirm it was there. The chain came free. She set it on the table in front of her. The silver face looked different outside her body, smaller, more ordinary. The kind of object that could sit in a bureau drawer or a sewing box and draw no attention at all. She opened it. The hinge was stiff from years of disuse. It took a small effort, and then it gave, and the 2 halves fell open on the table. On the left side, a small coil of pale hair, tied with a scrap of ribbon, pressed under a piece of glass. Fine hair, a boy's hair. The last he'd had before she'd cut it herself in the entrance hall of the Baltimore house, while men waited outside the door with professional patience. She breathed. On the right side, a button, brass, tarnished green at its edges, with a specific raised pattern around its face. She had memorized that pattern years ago. She would know it in the dark, with her eyes closed, at any distance. It had come loose from the coat of a man who had stood over a 10-year-old boy at the bottom of a staircase and chosen to straighten his own cuffs and leave. The kitchen was very quiet. She looked up. All three of them were watching her. Nobody moved. Nobody looked at the open locket with the hungry curiosity of men who'd been kept from a secret. They looked at her face instead, reading the same thing they'd always read there, what she needed, and what pace she was moving at, and whether to stay still or come closer. His name was Teddy, she said. She said it to all three of them. She kept her voice level by choice. She had told this story inside her own head 1,000 times, running through it in the dark, while she moved between cities and tried not to feel the weight of it. She was going to say it out loud now, for the first time, and she was going to say it correctly and without breaking, because Teddy deserved to be spoken of with steadiness. He was 10 years old, she said. My brother. Our father died 2 years before. It was just the two of us. She paused, arranging the words. A man named Thaddeus Vandermeer took an interest in our building. He owned a great deal of property in Baltimore, or controlled it. He came to the house on the pretense of discussing the rent arrangement. She stopped a moment. He wasn't there about the rent, she said. He made that clear after several visits. I was 22. He believed that my position, no father, no money, no advocate, made me available to him by default, as if circumstances had already decided the matter, and I was simply slow to understand it. She kept her hands flat on the table. I refused him, clearly and repeatedly. The fourth time he came, Teddy was on the landing above the entrance hall. He heard what Vandermeer was saying to me. She paused again. Teddy came down the stairs. He was 10 years old, and he came down anyway. Jonah's jaw shifted. He didn't speak. Vandermeer shoved him, she said. It wasn't planned, I don't think. It was the reflex of a man who had never in his life been challenged by someone he considered inconsequential. He had no idea what to do with a small boy inserting himself between him and what he wanted. Teddy fell from the third step. She felt the sound of it again, somewhere below thought. It lived there permanently now, that sound, below everything else she did and felt. It was enough. There was nothing to be done. She looked at the coil of hair under the glass. I cut that before the undertaker came, she said. The button had come loose in the fall. I found it on the hall floor afterward. I have been careful with both of them since that night. The fire cracked outside. A horse moved in the paddock, and one of the others answered softly. Vandermeer has considerable money, she said, and money in Baltimore buys silence with impressive efficiency. I understood within hours that no one was going to hear my account and act on it. No one who mattered was going to believe that a man of his standing had caused the death of a 10-year-old through something as ordinary as temper. She closed the locket, carefully, both halves together. The small, precise click of the clasp. So I took what I had and I ran. Silence held in the room. Then Nate leaned forward. He set his forearms on the table and looked at her across it, with those gray eyes that never pretended to feel something they didn't. The button, he said. Is it distinctive enough to identify the coat? Yes, she said. It's a custom pattern. He had the coat made in London. I looked into it that first year, when I thought there might be another route to justice. There's a tailor on Savile Row whose name is stamped in the lining. The button is part of a documented commission from a recorded client. Nate looked at the closed locket, then at her. And the hair, he said. Insurance, she said. Teddy's, clearly. A child's hair. If there were any question of identity, of whose case this was and whose death, she looked at him steadily. I know how courts work. Nate. I know what they require and what they discard and what can be dismissed by a man with enough money and the right lawyers. I have been building this argument in my mind for 3 years. I know what the evidence is worth and what I'd need to make it hold in front of a federal judge. Levi was looking at the table. His hands were flat on the wood and absolutely still. "What do you have?" Jonah asked, not doubting her, confirming, mapping the full shape of it. "The button," she said. "My testimony. Possibly the testimony of the undertaker, who saw Teddy's injuries and was instructed by Vandermeer's associate not to record the specific nature of the fall in his official report. He is a man who has lived uneasily with that instruction for 3 years and has indicated, through correspondence, that he is willing to speak." The brothers looked at each other. Not quickly, a long look. The visual shorthand of three people who had spent their whole lives in close proximity and had no need for words to cover the basic ground. Nate looked back at her. "What do you want us to do?" he said. She heard it clearly. Not "what are we going to do?" Not "here is what we've decided." "What do you want us to do?" He was placing the question in her hands. All three of them were placing it in her hands, without ceremony or negotiation, as if it had never occurred to any of them that the authority in this room might be distributed any other way. She had prepared herself for many possible responses. Not that one. She sat with it for a moment. She let it be what it was. "I want to go to federal court in Cheyenne," she said. "I want to stand up in front of a federal judge and say what happened to my brother and present that button. Vandermeer can purchase a city magistrate. He has done it before. He cannot purchase a federal court, and he knows it. That is precisely why he has been hunting me rather than waiting." She looked at the locket. "The evidence has never been the problem. I am the only living witness with access to it, and I have been running." She looked back at Nate. "I am done running," she said. Nate held her gaze for a long moment. Then he leaned back in his chair, and something in him moved to a new place. Not relaxation, but resolution. The posture of a man who had just received the information he needed to begin. "All right," he said. "Cheyenne." He looked at Levi, then Jonah. "He'll have word of the court date before we do. He'll move to stop us before we reach the city. We plan for that." "Eagles Pass," Levi said. Nate nodded slowly. Jonah pulled the accounts book toward him, flipped to a blank page, and began to write. They stayed at that table for 2 hours. They talked routes and timing and what was known about Vandermeer's resources and how many men Marcus Ridge could realistically assemble on short notice. She told them everything she'd accumulated in 3 years of staying ahead of the same man, his habits, his patterns, the way he moved money and people, the middlemen he used, and the way he insulated himself from the consequences of what those middlemen did. She told it plainly, and they listened and wrote it down and asked sharp, useful questions. She had never been the one with the information before. She had always been the one being informed, told what was happening to her and what her options were, presented with the facts of her own situation as if they were news. Being the one who knew things the others needed to know felt strange in her throat and clarifying in her spine. "Once we file the hearing date," Nate said, "eventually, there's no drawing back. Vandermeer will know within a week, and he will act fast. Everything we do between filing and the courthouse steps in Cheyenne has to be planned and held to." He looked at Della directly. "Once you start this, we finish it together, all the way through." "I know," she said. "We are with you," he said. "Every step." She looked at all three of them, and they looked back at her with complete steadiness, and she thought about a crossroads in November snow and a man who had held out a ticket and said, "You don't owe us anything." And she thought about how far that moment was from this one, and how the line between them had been straight even when she couldn't see it. "Then let's go to Cheyenne," she said. Nate filed the hearing request by courier on a Friday in the second week of February. He did not do it from Stillwater Bend, where the action would be noted and the information would travel. He rode south 2 days to a larger town with a federal post office and filed it there, under a clerk who didn't know his face or his name or what the papers were attached to. And then he rode back without stopping. He arrived home after midnight and came in cold and covered in snow dust and sat down at the table while Levi built the fire and Jonah set water on for coffee. And he said, simply, "It's done." They had 10 days before the hearing date. Nate spent those 10 days building a trap. He did not consult Vandermeer's schedule, or his connections, or his likely routes. He didn't need to. He understood the fundamental logic of the situation, and the logic pointed directly to Eagles Pass. Eagles Pass was a half-mile-long gorge in the rocky terrain 30 miles north of Cheyenne, where the road to the city threaded through the only viable gap between a wall of bluffs to the east and a steep-sided canyon to the west. There was no alternate route for a party traveling by road. Everyone came through the pass. Anyone who wanted to intercept travelers between the bench country and Cheyenne knew this. Any man with local knowledge who had a contract to stop someone from reaching that city would set his ambush at Eagles Pass. It was simply the geography. Nate had been through the pass a dozen times in the years since they'd come to Wyoming. He knew every feature of it. The dry creek bed along the west wall that offered cover, and a high sight line down into the road below. The boulder field on the east approach, where a man could hold a position without skylining himself against the bluffs. The point where the gorge narrowed to its tightest passage, 40 feet across, where the echo would turn a single gunshot into a wall of sound. He rode through it twice in the days before they left. Once in the morning, once in the afternoon light. Reading it the way he read, terrain as a problem with a solution, if you took the time to find it. He came back from the second ride and spread his map on the table and showed Della everything he'd seen and thought. She leaned over the map beside him. He didn't simplify it for her. He showed it to her the same way he'd have shown it to Jonah or Levi, the actual terrain, the actual distances, the actual positions he intended to use, and why. When she asked a question, he answered it with the full information. When she identified a gap in the plan, he acknowledged it. And they worked through it together. She had been shooting for 2 months by then, every clear morning at the split-rail fence, then at increasing distance as her accuracy improved, then from movement, then from awkward positions that imitated the kind of terrain she might actually need to shoot from. Nate was a patient teacher and an exacting one. He did not lower his standards for her, and she did not ask him to. She had put in the work until the revolver was familiar in her hand, and the recoil was something she anticipated and absorbed rather than reacted to. 40 feet of open ground here, she said, pointing at the narrowest section of the gorge on the map. If they're in the boulder field, and we come through the road, we're exposed. We don't come through the road, Nate said. He moved her finger left to the creek bed. We're already in position when they arrive. She followed his reasoning. The 4 of them would move out 2 days before the hearing date, give Vandermeer's men time to set their ambush, and then enter the pass before first light. Not through the road, but through the creek bed along the west wall, where the cover was thick and the sight lines ran the length of the gorge from above. They would be in position before Ridge and his men arrived. We let them come to us, she said. We already know the ground, Nate said. They've never set foot in it. That is not a small difference. She looked at the map. She thought about what Jonah had said to her in November, standing over a frozen creek with fishing rods. A person who knows the land doesn't get lost in it, even in the dark. She thought about what Levi had taught her at the forge, the patience of it, the attention to conditions. She thought about 3 months of learning the ground she was standing on. Vandermeer had sent men after her for 3 years. He had sent them to cities and rooming houses and coaches and towns. He had never sent them to a place where she knew the land, and they didn't. When do we leave? She said. Day after tomorrow, Nate said. Before light. She nodded. They loaded in the dark on a Wednesday morning, the last cold morning of February. The mountains were blue-black against a sky still full of stars. She wore her wool coat and her heavy boots, and she loaded the revolver herself, in the kitchen, by lamplight, with the same deliberate attention Nate had taught her. She checked the cylinder twice. She set it in her coat pocket. Jonah came to the kitchen doorway while she was doing it. He watched her without comment for a moment. Then he said, "You eat something first." She ate something first. They reached the mouth of Eagles Pass before dawn on the Thursday. Nate led them off the road and into the creek bed in the dark, moving slow and quiet through the dry scrub along the base of the west wall. The cold was deep and still, and the only sound was the careful placement of boots on frozen ground. She moved behind Levi and in front of Jonah, and she focused entirely on footing and silence. They were in position along the high ground of the creek bed before the sky began to go gray. Nate put them each where he wanted them, working by gesture in the near dark. Della, he placed in a natural depression in the rock shelf above the creek bed's solid cover on 3 sides. A clear sight line east across the road below, protected from direct fire from the boulder field. He set his hand briefly on her shoulder, and she felt the steadiness in it. That transfer of certainty he made sometimes in place of words, and then he moved away to his own position 20 yards north. She waited. The sun came up behind the bluffs and sent its light into the gorge at a low angle that turned the rock walls amber. Beautiful, she thought, and then filed the beauty away and kept her eyes on the road below. Ridge came at mid-morning. She heard them before she saw them. 7 horses, moving at a controlled pace. She counted the sounds automatically. Nate had taught her to count sounds the way he counted sight lines. 7 horses, at least 7 men, possibly 8. Ridge she recognized from the description, even at distance. Gray coat, gray horse, measured pace. He rode at the front of the group, and he was reading the terrain as he came in, the way professionals did, noting the walls and the narrowing and the sight lines. He was good. She could see that in the way he moved his eyes across the gorge. He just didn't know Nate had been here first. She pressed herself flat against the rock and watched. Nate's shot came from the north end of the passes, a single crack that echoed the length of the gorge and multiplied into something enormous. It hit the road surface 6 feet in front of Ridge's horse. Deliberate. A warning shot. Ridge's horse shied, and he controlled it with practiced ease. Ridge did not shout or panic, he said, loud and clear into the gorge. You're outgunned. 7-4. Stand down. Nate's voice came back from somewhere above and to the left. Count again, Mr. Ridge. There was a pause. Then Levi opened up from the east side of the creek bed. What followed was not the clean affair that men sometimes described afterward when they retold these things. It was loud and close and chaotic, in the way that all such things were chaotic: men and horses and gunfire and the walls of the gorge throwing sound back until the air was full of it. She pressed her back against the rock shelf, and the revolver was in her hand, and she was not shaking. She was. She noted with some distant part of herself, entirely present, not frozen, not hiding, present. 2 of Ridge's men broke right, toward the boulder field, away from Levi's position. They came up the east slope, and she had a clear angle, and she was already moving before she'd consciously decided. She went to one knee at the edge of the shelf, and she sighted the way Nate had taught her find the rear sight. Find the front sight. Find the target. Breathe out. Take out the slack, and she fired twice. The first shot went wide. The second did not. The man went down behind the boulders and didn't rise. She reloaded with her hands steady and her eyes on the road below. Vandermeer appeared at the south mouth of the pass at exactly the wrong moment, or the right one, depending on how you looked at it. He came in on a black horse, too far back to be in the first group, the buffer of hired men between himself and consequences, the move of a man who always kept a buffer between himself and consequences. He was well-dressed even here, even in a canyon in February. London coat, silver buttons catching the morning light. She recognized the buttons. She did not think about it for long. She sighted, breathed, fired at the horse. It was a hard shot at distance. Moving target. Adrenaline in her blood. She almost didn't trust what she'd done. But the black horse lurched and came down hard, and Vandermeer pitched forward out of the saddle and landed in the road at the mouth of the gorge, and lay there while the horse struggled upright and moved away, injured in the foreleg, not dead. The gunfire from the north stopped. Then Levi's position went quiet. Then Jonah's. The echo died away, and the gorge was silent. She stayed where she was, revolver up, breathing. Della, Nate's voice, controlled and clear, from somewhere above and to her left. Here, she called back. Stay put. She stayed put. She listened. She heard one man moving in the boulder field and then not moving. She heard Ridge's gray horse somewhere south, moving away at speed. She heard, distantly, the sound of Vandermeer's voice from the mouth of the gorge. Not words yet, just the sound of a man beginning to understand the shape of his situation. Levi appeared at the bottom of the shelf below her. He looked up at her without speaking and checked her face for damage. The fast check she'd seen him make in the barn when she'd come around a corner. Too fast inventory, not sentiment. He found what he was looking for. She was whole, and he nodded once. She climbed down from the shelf and joined him. Nate and Jonah converged from the north end of the pass. Jonah had a graze on his left forearm. The outer edge of his coat sleeve ripped through, and he was pressing a folded cloth against it, with the focused concentration of a man who had been hurt before and knew the proper sequence of responses. "How bad?" she said. "Inconvenient," he said. He showed her. The graze was real but shallow. The kind of wound that bled dramatically and required attention, and was not, in the final accounting, serious. He accepted the assessment without argument or theater. Nate took stock of the pass. 3 of Ridge's men down in the gorge, 1 in the boulder field. Ridge himself gone south with whatever speed his gray horse could manage. Vandermeer at the south mouth, sitting in the road, unhorsed and unhurt, but surrounded on all sides by a terrain he didn't know, with his hired men scattered or gone. Nate walked the length of the gorge and came back. "Ridge is gone," he said. "He'll reassemble if we give him time." "We don't give him time." He looked at Levi and Jonah, then at Della. "We get Vandermeer on a horse, and we ride for Cheyenne tonight." She looked toward the south mouth of the pass, where the silver buttons were visible in the road, gleaming in the morning light. "Tonight," she said. The federal courthouse in Cheyenne sat at the end of Ferguson Street. 3 stories of territorial sandstone, with a portico of heavy columns and a flag that moved in the constant Wyoming wind. She had been building toward this building in her mind for 3 years without ever having seen it. Now she stood in front of it, and it was simply a building solid, real, full of people doing the ordinary work of the law. And she thought, this is what you ran for, right here. They had come in the night. All 4 of them plus Vandermeer under Levi's guard on a tethered horse. Arriving in Cheyenne before first light and delivering the man to the federal marshal's office before the night clerk had finished his coffee. The paperwork had been filed before dawn. The hearing was confirmed for 9 o'clock the following morning. She slept 4 hours in a rented room above the hotel on Capitol Avenue and woke in the gray light and lay still and checked herself, the way she'd been doing for months now. Honest accounting. No pretending. No managing what she found. She was afraid. She acknowledged it. She was also ready. And that fact sat alongside the fear, without either of them displacing the other. She got up. She dressed carefully. She pinned her hair, without hurrying, and she looked at herself in the small mirror above the washstand, and she thought, this is what someone looks like who is about to do the thing they came all the way across the country to do. The locket sat at her throat, as it always did. She pressed her fingers to it once. Then she walked out the door. Nate was in the hall. He was dressed in his good coat, and his hat was in his hands, and he looked at her in the quiet, complete way he had, reading what was on her face with those gray eyes. And then he offered his arm. She took it. They walked the length of Ferguson Street together. Jonah and Levi were at the courthouse steps. Jonah had wrapped his arm in clean linen, and he held himself with the careful steadiness of a man working around discomfort and unwilling to let it show. Levi stood with his hands loose at his sides and looked at her when she came up the steps and said, very quietly, "You know this." She did know this. She had been knowing this for 3 years. They went inside. The federal courtroom was larger than she'd expected and smaller than she'd feared. High ceilings, long windows letting in the February light, benches of dark wood on either side of the central aisle. A bar separated the gallery from the court itself. Behind the bar, the witness stand, the counsel tables, the bench where the judge would sit. In the gallery, people she didn't know, people she'd never have identified as connected to this case. taking their seats with the quiet efficiency of people who understood what they were there for. Vandermeer was at the defense table. He had been given time to compose himself, and he had used it well. His coat was fresh, not the one from the gorge. His hair was arranged. He had the bearing of a man who had occupied positions of authority for so long that it had become his natural posture, and he wore it even here. Even in a federal courtroom, where he faced charges that could end in a rope. She looked at him directly from across the room. He looked back. His face was very controlled. She had feared that look for 3 years its coldness, its absolute certainty that she was without recourse. She looked at it now and felt something clarify in her, clean and absolute, like the strike of iron on an anvil. She did not look away. He was the first to look away. She filed that away and took her seat at the prosecution's table. Her attorney was a woman named Margaret Hall, which still struck her every time she thought of it. A woman attorney in Cheyenne. Della had not known to ask for one, and had found her through the marshal's referral, and had sat in her office the evening before, and understood within 10 minutes that Margaret Hall was the most formidable person she had encountered in years of meeting formidable people. She was small and precise, and moved through legal argument the way Levi moved through ironwork, with the absolute confidence of someone who understood their material at a level that went below conscious thought. The judge entered. The room stood when they sat. Della's hands were on the table, in front of her, and she made herself keep them there, open and still, rather than at her throat. The charges were read. Murder in the 2nd degree, in the death of Edward Marsh, minor, aged 10 years, in the city of Baltimore, Maryland, in the winter of 1876. They heard the words fill the courtroom and settle, and she breathed through them and let them be what they were. The truth made official. At last, after 3 years of official silence, when the time came, Margaret Hall said, "The prosecution calls Della Calder to the witness stand." She stood. She walked to the stand, and she did not hurry. And she did not look at Vandermeer, and she did not look at the gallery. She looked at the clerk, took the Bible he offered, said the words she'd been saying in her mind for 3 years. "I do, I will. The truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth." She sat in the witness chair. Margaret Hall began with simple questions: name, residence, relationship to the deceased. She answered them in a level, audible voice that carried to the back of the room. She had decided weeks ago that she would not speak quietly in this room, not from anger. She was past anger now, past the hot consuming kind, settled into something colder and more precise. She would not speak quietly, because Edward Marsh had deserved to be spoken of at full volume, and he was going to receive it. Then the questions went to that night. She told it. She told the whole of it, in sequence, without pausing for effect, and without softening anything. The visits to the house, the clear nature of Vandermeer's intentions, her refusals, the 4th visit, Teddy on the landing, Teddy coming down. The stairs with 10-year-old courage and 10-year-old certainty that you intervened when someone you loved was being threatened, regardless of the relative sizes involved. She did not look at Vandermeer while she spoke. She looked at Margaret Hall, who nodded once with professional precision, and she looked at the judge, who was writing steadily in his notes, and she looked at the window above the gallery, where the February sky showed blue and sharp. When she came to the moment of the fall, she stopped and gathered herself, not dramatically, just the pause of a person who is being honest and knows it. Then she said it, plainly and fully, and did not look away from the window. "He fell from the 3rd step," she said. He did not get up. The courtroom was very still. Vandermeer stood over him for approximately 30 seconds, she said. He did not call for help. He did not kneel beside him. He straightened his coat. Then he left. Margaret Hall waited a moment. "Then, Mrs. Calder, you have presented to this court a piece of physical evidence. Please describe that evidence for the record." She reached into her coat pocket. She placed the button on the rail in front of her. It sat there in the February light, small and green-edged and specific. "This button came loose from Vandermeer's coat in the fall," she said. "It is from a London commission, made for him specifically. documented by the tailor Dunmore and Son on Savile Row, London, who recorded the commission under Vandermeer's name and whose bill of sale Margaret Hall has entered into evidence. There is no other coat made with this button. It is not a common design. She looked at Vandermeer then. She looked at him full and direct, the way Levi had taught her, without meaning to. You can't fix what you won't look at, and you can't testify to what you look away from. This button was in his coat when he stood over my brother, she said. It came off in the same fall that killed Teddy. I have carried it for 3 years. I am presenting it now. Vandermeer's face did not change. He was too practiced for that. But his attorney, beside him, put his pen down on the table. The cross-examination was aggressive and long, and she had expected both. Vandermeer's attorney was skilled, and he had done what skilled attorneys did, built his case around her instability, her grief, her motivation to destroy a man she blamed for her brother's death. He asked questions that were designed to reframe everything she said as the distorted account of a desperate woman. He circled the button, probing its chain of custody, suggesting any button from any coat could be produced 3 years after the fact. She answered every question. She answered them without heat and without flinching, drawing on what 3 months of living honestly with 3 men who demanded nothing less from her had done to the structure of her thinking. When he implied she was lying, she did not become defensive. I am telling you what I saw. When he suggested her grief had distorted her memory, she said, grief does not change the color of a button or the name of the man who commissioned it. He sat down. Eventually, the undertaker from Baltimore testified by written deposition, read into the record by Margaret Hall in a careful, unhurried voice. He described the injuries. He described being approached by Vandermeer's associate and instructed to record the death as an accidental fall rather than the result of being pushed. He stated that he had complied at the time and had spent 3 years unable to account for himself satisfactorily, and had been willing to say so in a court of law because the truth was the truth whether or not it was convenient for anyone. The tailor's records came in. The button sat on the rail. The room waited. The judge took 40 minutes. He came back with his decision written out, and he read it from the bench without editorial comment, which was how decisions of this nature should be delivered, in the plain language of the law, without flourish, because the law at its best did not need decoration. Thaddeus Vandermeer was found guilty of murder in the 2nd degree. The sentence was death by hanging. Della sat at the prosecution table and heard it and breathed. She felt Jonah's hand touch her shoulder from the bench behind her. She felt the warmth of it, and she put her hand over his for a moment and looked at the window and the sky and thought about Teddy, who had come down the stairs because he was 10 years old, and he had believed with the whole of his undiminished heart that some things were worth coming down the stairs for. She had believed the same thing. She still did. She pressed her fingers to the locket at her throat. She pressed them gently and held them there for a moment, the way she had held them 1,000 times before. But this time she felt not just the cold silver of it. She felt the warmth underneath, her own warmth, the warmth she'd been carrying all along beneath the grief. She lowered her hand. She stood up. Epilogue spring came to Calder Hollow in the middle of April, all at once and without apology. One morning the ground was still frozen, and the creek was still low, and the pines still had the dark, weighted look of winter. Then overnight something shifted in the air, and the next morning the creek was running full and loud, and the mud along the fence line was soft, and the cottonwood at the south edge of the property had put out its first leaf buds in a pale and tentative green. Della stood at the kitchen window with her coffee and watched the cottonwood. She had known that tree since November, when the branches were bare and black against the snow. She knew it as a fixed point from her bedroom window, as a landmark Jonah had pointed to on her first drive up the hollow road. That's the southern boundary, he'd said. You can always find your way back by it. In winter, it had looked like all the other bare trees, skeleton-shaped, reduced. In April, it looked like a completely different thing, like something that had been waiting the whole time. She set down her coffee. She went to the chest in the hall and took out the small flat stone she'd carried from the creek bank 2 days ago. It fit in her palm gray granite, smooth from years of water, solid and permanent looking. She'd thought about what to put on it. She'd sat with the question for a week. In the end, she'd asked Levi, who cut letters in iron and knew the weight of small inscriptions. The stone had one word on it, cut carefully into the face. Teddy, she carried it outside into the April morning. The air was cold still, Wyoming cold. The season new and not yet confident in itself. But the light was different. It was spring light, the long kind, and it made the hollow look wider and cleaner and full of a potential that the compressed winter months had been keeping in reserve. She walked the length of the yard, past the paddock where the horses were moving, with the loose energy of animals glad to be out, past the corner of the barn, where Levi had hung a new length of iron he'd been working on all week. He looked up when she passed. He saw the stone in her hand and what was in her face. He put down his work and fell into step beside her without a word. Jonah came from the direction of the creek, wet-booted, with a fishing rod in his hand, and he saw them and came too. Nate was at the cottonwood already. He had been at the fence line earlier. She'd seen him from the kitchen window, but he was here now, standing at the base of the tree, looking at the new leaves overhead. He turned when he heard them coming, and he looked at the stone in her hand, and then at her face, and he was simply there. All three of them were simply there. That was all they'd ever needed to be. She knelt at the base of the cottonwood. The ground was soft here, the mud giving, and she pressed the stone into it. At the root line where it would stay, she set it, flat and level, and pressed it firm with both palms, and then she remained there a moment, kneeling in the spring mud, with her hands on the stone. She thought about Teddy. She thought about him clearly and fully and without flinching, the way she could now. She thought about his hair, which was pale like hers, and the gap in his front teeth that he'd been waiting to grow back in. She thought about the way he'd said her name, Della. 3 years old when he learned it, and he'd never mispronounced it once. She thought about him on the stairs, 10 years old, coming down. She thought about his courage, and she let herself be proud of it. She pressed her palms flat on the stone one last time. There, she said. She stood up. The three men were around her, and the cottonwood was above them, and the spring light came through the new leaves in pieces, moving slightly, the way light moved in all the places she'd ever found safe. She looked up through it for a moment, and then she looked at the tree, and she thought, this is a good place. This is a good place to leave a piece of him. Green in spring and bare in winter, and always here at the southern boundary, where a person can find their way back. She turned to face the hollow. She looked at the cabin, and the barn, and the smokehouse, and the paddock, and the mountains above them all, still white at their tops. Permanent, the creek she'd learned to fish in. The forge in the barn where she'd drawn her first iron taper. The window of the room with the deadbolt she hadn't thrown in months. I have something to tell you, she said. All three of them were looking at her. She had known for 3 weeks. She had sat with it, held it, turned it over in her mind, and checked it from every angle, the way she checked everything, now honestly, without pretending to find something other than what was there. What was there was real and good, and larger than anything she'd known how to want when she'd stepped off that stagecoach in November. I'm carrying a child, she said. Jonah made a sound she had never heard from him before. It was involuntary, and brief and full, the sound of a man hit by something he'd hoped for with his whole chest without ever quite believing would arrive. He pressed his hand over his face for a moment, and when he lowered it, his eyes were bright, and his face was open in a way she had never seen it. Every careful layer of it simply gone. Levi said nothing. He stepped toward her, and she expected him to do what he sometimes did, put his hand on her shoulder, brief and certain. Instead, he drew her into his arms and held her, and she felt him breathe against the top of her head, and she felt his shoulders shake. Once, the single, involuntary shudder of a man who had decided he was not going to cry and was negotiating with himself about it and losing. He won. Barely, but he won. She pressed her face against his chest for a moment, and then stepped back. She looked at Nate. He was standing very still. His hat was in his hands, and his eyes were wet, and he was making absolutely no effort to pretend otherwise. Nate called her, who said only what he meant, and meant every word of it, who had never, in her observation, made a performance of anything he felt. Stood in the mud beneath the cottonwood tree in the April light, with his eyes full and his hat pressed to his heart. Della, he said, just her name, the way he'd said it the first night, over a dying fire at midnight in the blizzard-loud cabin. I know, she said. He reached out and took her hand in both of his large, careful hands, the hands she'd watched plan and build and hold the wheel steady through 40 miles of mountain road. And he held it without speaking, and she let him. And the four of them stood together under the cottonwood, while the spring pushed through the hollow in its determined and unannounced way. She reached up. She pressed her fingers to the locket. It was warm. It was her warmth, pressed into the silver over months of wearing it. And underneath that warmth was Teddy's hair and Vandermeer's button and 3 years of running and the sound of a boy on a staircase and the long, cold aftermath of all of it. She pressed her fingers to it, and she felt all of that. And she felt this too, the mud under her boots, and the spring air, and the hand holding hers, and the two men beside her, and the child that was a fact, and a future, and a completely unexpected grace. The locket did not come off. She had not taken it off after the courthouse, as she'd half expected to. She had sat with that expectation, and examined it, and found, ultimately, that she didn't want to. The locket was Teddy. Teddy did not stop being part of her because Vandermeer had been held to account. The grief didn't resolve that way, and she had stopped expecting it to. She carried him as she had always carried him. She would carry him always. But it was different now. She pressed her fingers to it, and she felt the warmth, and she felt the weight, and she felt the way it sat against her chest without dragging. 3 years it had hung like a stone on a rope. She had made herself carry it because it was the truth, and she was not a woman who put down the truth because it was heavy. She had carried it through cities and coaches and winter mountains and a federal courtroom, and it had done what it was supposed to do. It had gotten her here. Here was this. Here was the hollow in spring, and 3 men she had chosen, with her eyes open, and a child she hadn't planned, and a small stone with 1 word on it under a cottonwood at the southern boundary. Here was the end of running. Here was the beginning of something she didn't have a full name for, yet, but recognized the shape of. She recognized it from being 8 years old, before everything went wrong. The unrestricted feeling, the world with margin in it. She lowered her hand from the locket. She looked out at the mountains. They were doing what mountains did in April, shedding their winter white in patches, the dark rock showing through, the permanent stone beneath the seasonal covering. Still enormous, still indifferent, in the way that large permanent things were indifferent. Not unkind, just ancient and incurious, going about the long business of being mountains, while smaller things moved and hurt, and healed and loved, and planted stones in the ground, and announced new lives under cottonwood trees in the spring. She thought, I have work to do. She thought it with pleasure, not burden. The accounts, which she now managed entirely. The ledger for the spring cattle arrangement Jonah had been putting off. The vegetable plot she'd been planning along the south wall of the cabin, where the afternoon sun came in long and strong. Letters she'd been composing to Margaret Hall and to the undertaker from Baltimore, who had, in the end, told the truth and deserved to hear that it had mattered. Things to learn still. Iron and fish and weather, and the names of all the trees she hadn't learned yet. A child in the fall. Jonah came to her left side and put his arm around her shoulders, careful of nothing, simply present. Levi was on her right, close enough that she felt his warmth without him touching her. Nate released her hand and stepped beside Jonah, and the 4 of them stood in a loose alignment at the base of the cottonwood and looked out at the hollow and the mountains behind it. What do you want to plant along the south wall? Jonah asked. His voice was still rough from the tears he'd let himself have for the first time in what she guessed was a long time, and he said it as if that roughness was unremarkable. because with Jonah, everything real was unremarkable. It was just the state of things, worth naming and moving forward. She thought about it. Beans, she said, and maybe something for color, something useless and pretty, just because we're allowed. Levi made a sound that was as close as he ever came to a laugh. Nate said, "We've got seed in the store shed. I'll find what we have." She looked at the small stone among the cottonwood roots. She thought, "I see you, Teddy. I did the thing. I kept the button and I said the words and I stood up in that room and I did not look away and I did not shake. You would have liked the mountains. You would have followed Levi into the barn every afternoon, asking questions until you either answered them or put something in your hands to keep you occupied. You would have had Jonah's sourdough figured out in a week. You would have sat on the porch in the mornings and watched the peaks go through their changes in the light. I'm going to teach your niece or nephew about all of it." She pressed her fingers to the locket one last time, a single touch of acknowledgement, a small and private word between them that required no other language. Then she turned away from the tree. She walked back across the hollow toward the cabin, and the three men came with her, and the spring came with her, too. Pushing up through the mud along the fence line, and the first green along the creek bank, and the new leaves on the cottonwood at the southern boundary that she could always find her way back to, even in the dark. The locket rested warm against her chest. It was no longer what she ran with. It was what she came home wearing. And so, as spring finally returned to Calder Hollow, Della's journey came full circle. She had arrived in Wyoming during the coldest season of her life, carrying only $42, a silver locket, and the unbearable weight of everything she had lost. She stepped off that stagecoach, believing survival meant staying one step ahead of the men who wanted to control her. But by the time the snow melted and the first green leaves appeared on the cottonwood tree, she had learned something far greater. Survival is not only about escaping the place that hurt you. It is also about finding the courage to build a life in which that pain no longer decides who you are. Della's story reminds us that healing rarely happens in one dramatic moment. It happens slowly, through small acts of patience, respect, and kindness. It began with a stagecoach ticket placed in her hand instead of an order telling her what to do. It continued with a bedroom door that locked from the inside, a cup of coffee waiting at the table, a blanket offered without questions, and three men who understood that love could not be demanded. Nate, Jonah, and Levi did not heal Della by controlling her choices. They helped her heal by returning those choices to her. That may be the greatest lesson this story gives us. Real love does not build a cage around the person it claims to protect. Real love creates a place where that person can breathe, decide, grow, and become strong again. The Calder brothers stood beside Della, but they never tried to stand in her place. When danger came, they offered their protection. Yet they also placed a revolver in her hand and taught her how to defend herself. When she revealed the truth about Teddy, they did not decide what justice should look like for her. They asked, "What do you want us to do?" In that simple question, they gave her back the authority that cruel men had spent years trying to steal. Della also teaches us that courage does not mean the absence of fear. She was afraid when she heard that Marcus Ridge was searching for her. She was afraid when she opened the locket. She was afraid at Eagles Pass and when she entered the courtroom in Cheyenne. But courage is not waiting until fear disappears. Courage is carrying that fear with you and still taking the next necessary step. It is speaking even when your voice might tremble. It is standing before the person who once made you feel powerless and refusing to look away. For 3 years, the silver locket represented Della's grief. It carried Teddy's hair, Vandermeer's button, and the memory of a terrible night that had shaped every day afterward. Yet, by the end, the locket had changed without changing at all. It still held the same objects. It still carried the same truth. But it no longer pulled her backward. The weight had not vanished, Della had simply grown strong enough to carry it differently. And perhaps that is what healing truly means. Healing does not always erase the wound. It does not ask us to forget the people we lost or pretend that injustice never happened. Sometimes healing means learning that grief and joy can live inside the same heart. Della could mourn Teddy beneath the cottonwood tree and still celebrate the child growing inside her. She could remember the life that was taken and welcome the new life that was coming. Her happiness did not betray her grief. It proved that the man who tried to destroy her had failed. The story also reminds us that home is not merely the place where we were born. Home is the place where we are allowed to be fully ourselves. For Della, home became a cabin in the Wyoming mountains, a hearth surrounded by mismatched chairs, 4 cups of coffee, a forge in the barn, and a cottonwood marking the southern boundary. It was not perfect, and it was not free from danger. But it was a place where her voice mattered. It was a place she had chosen. Every one of us carries something like Della's locket. It may be grief, regret, betrayal, fear, or a memory we cannot put down. We may spend years believing that the weight of it is the whole story of who we are. But Della's journey shows us that the things we carry do not have to become the things that control us. We can honor the past without living inside it. We can remember without surrendering our future. And even after the longest winter, we can still plant something beautiful simply because we are finally free to do so. Thank you for joining us on this unforgettable journey through the American frontier. Tell us in the comments which part of Della's transformation touched you the most, and if this story reminded you that courage, dignity, and love can survive even the harshest winter. Please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who may need to hear its message today. Until our next journey into the Wild West, remember, sometimes home is not the place where your story begins. It is the place where you finally become free to write the rest of it. All elements within this narrative are fictional and crafted for storytelling purposes. The author bears no intention of referencing real people, cultures, or events in a literal sense. Readers are encouraged to engage with the work as a piece of creative expression rather than documented reality.